So for today's presentation, I'll be zooming into this idea of network mobility divide, building on our conception of the digital divide, right? So who has the question of access with resources and the outcomes of digital media use. But I'm more interested in looking at the case of older migrants and their fragmented social networks, not only connecting locally, but also transnationally, and how's that panning out in terms of how you age in your host country while also connecting to the people in your host country, but also from your home country. So what you can see on my slide is actually some examples of visuals that I'll be showcasing today. And I use visual methods as part of my project, particularly content elicitation, wherein participants will be sharing contents, but also me documenting objects, photos, technologies, and infrastructures in the home setting where I conducted the interview. So on your left, that's the side table in the bedroom of one of my participants. She's playing Sudoku every now and then before sleeping, but also has a version of that in an iPad, playing and kind of like having that entertainment before bedtime. So she's well connected, which I'll be talking about her case down the track. But on your right is actually connection of internet in one of the provinces in the Philippines wherein I had to climb like a bit of a mountain to just access that internet. And you need to put 1 peso, so that's very kind of like cents in dollars, to give you 9 minutes of internet access. And this is just an example of how technologies are provided around people, but also a question of infrastructures very different, embedded, and operating across geographical scales. So today's presentation is actually I think it's not working. Let me just stop sharing the screen. I think I'll just use my PowerPoint slide. This might work. So I think in terms of like thinking about the project, for me, I'm very interested with how the digital divide is actually navigated by people in the margins, particularly older migrants and their networks. So the focus of the project is really funded by the Australian Research Council, which I was introduced by Denise. So I'm one of the recipients of this very prestigious project, and I'm looking at the older migrants in Australia. So we have an increasingly aging population in Australia, 20% of the Australian population aging, but more importantly, 1.2 million are actually aging born overseas. So I am taking the case of the Filipino Australians in Victoria, Australia, considered as the fifth largest migrant community in Australia, but also in terms of the number, it's quite huge in Victoria with this aging population. So what I want to inquire about my project, broadly speaking, is really examining the kind of like technologies being used by these individuals and their networks, particularly smartphones, laptops, desktop computers, social media channels, mobile applications, and even smart devices in the home setting. And I'm also interested in thinking beyond the technology, what are the social factors that might be shaping the connective and disconnective practices of these individuals, and understand what are the challenges and how did they cope with these challenges, as particularly shaped by connecting to their networks locally and transnationally, and then giving us a perspective or a vantage point to really think about what is really the digital divide in this particular context. So I am looking at Australia and also the Philippines as a case study. So I'm looking at older migrants in Australia, relatively accessing all of these technologies, internet connections, infrastructures. However, despite the relatively stable kind of like digital landscape in Australia, older people struggle in terms of the national kind of like narrative in here, where in age 65 to 74 record scores of 12.1 points below the national average. So in Australia, we're kind of like measuring digital inclusion based on the index of access, affordability, and digital ability. What are the outcomes for these individuals? So for older people, grappling and really struggling in terms of those kind of like criteria. We have big telecommunication companies in here. We have Telstra, Optus, Vodafone, and a lot more providing services. But also Australia has positioned itself having the national broadband network, wherein providing a very fast internet connectivity, but also being politicized because not everyone's able to access that kind of like fast internet, especially in regional areas. Well, we go to the Philippines now. That the Philippines is considered kind of like connected, but not necessarily connected for all. As you can see in my slide in here, 31.24 million did not use the internet in around 2020 for. At the same time, we also have this culture of tingi or sachet culture, wherein most people would go for a plan. You pay monthly, but in the Philippines, which I noticed with my participants, we call this sachet culture, wherein you just pay via prepaid. So with prepaid, as I mentioned earlier, you pay something and that's just running for a few minutes or hours or something like that. So it's quite limiting in that space. But at the same time, in terms of the telecommunication landscape, we have big companies like PLDT, Globe, Smart, and also the new entrant Dito Telecommunity. So they're all promising this kind of like connectivity, a smooth connection for Filipinos, allowing them to connect locally but also transnationally. But as I will be discussing shortly, it's quite problematic when you start thinking about this landscape of the digital. Okay, so for this paper, I'm actually looking and really reflecting on this idea of a network mobility divide. So this conception is actually building on a conversation between mobility's paradigm, digital inequalities, migration, and aging. So I'm trying to have a conversation with concepts in these particular fields and merge them, and particularly thinking about how mobilities are being constructed in digital spaces. So for me, the mobility divide is actually capturing and articulating that relational, situated, and affective and uneven mobilities produced through an assemblage of tightly entwined human and non-human entities influenced by the social, cultural, material, economic, technological, and structural forces. I'll just show this photo on the screen wherein you can see on your left is actually the house of my participant aging in Australia, a huge house with a huge television, but doesn't have an internet because she doesn't use the internet. She lives alone. And then when I follow the family members back home, you can see the photo in a very small room trying to use an internet for around 7 people inside that space and sharing devices, but also trying to access the smartphone, and then the television, trying to grapple with the slow connection. This is just showing how this disparity of the basic access with the conditions of people and how that condition might be shaping the interaction and kind of like even the pressures and the stresses of connecting locally but also transnationally. So let's look first at the mobilities paradigm in the migration context. So the mobilities lens, looking at the work of Uri, highlighting that people's movements, corporeal or non-corporeal or digital mobilities, would be shaped by network capital. That's depending on the people that you connect with, the resources that you have, the time, the space, the environment, and even kind of like the different affective connections that you have that allow you to move smoothly in a digital space. But there's also that uneven mobility in that space because of the differing backgrounds of individuals, differing capitals, as Uri would be suggesting. And I'm situating that in the context now of older people and thinking about their mobility in digital spaces, but also in offline spaces. So there's so many literature now on aging in a transnational social field, particularly looking at practices of older people, older migrants in general, specifically, using practices of sending remittances, gathering in public spaces, connecting with their peers and networks, and that kind of like perspective life course wherein we are given a vantage point to think about people's lives are changing and those changes can be affecting really the kind of everyday lives and practices of these individuals. And then there's a digital layer wherein deeply examined by the work of Baldassar and a lot of scholars talking about this sense of homing and kinning through digital technologies. However, this literature would be also showing us that there are challenges of aging that we need to center and really talk about because they're crucial in how technologies are perceived, used, and not used in different contexts. So the challenges of aging for older people would be the kind of like limited mobility because of health. They have health concerns with their eyesight, their fingers, their knees. They have language barriers for older migrants. They have shrinking networks. And at the same time, they have mobile family members and networks moving from their house out of their house and then moving elsewhere. And they need to sustain those connections. So this is like part of the life course, changing the lives of older migrants. But at the same time, you have fast evolving technologies that you have to manage and incorporate in your everyday life. And how's that shaping your life? And that's where we start thinking about our current environment. So we think of platforms now as a kind of like connecting migrants and also their networks and also the older migrants in this study. But we also need to think about how the platforms operate in terms of collecting, harvesting, filtering, and processing all of this data for surveillance, profit making, and exploitation. And there's so much discussion now about datification, AI, personalization, and automation. And with my study, I've been noticing that and that shaping the perception and experiences of technologies by the participants. And they grapple with interfaces, altered synthetic contents, but also the digital literacies uneven. But there's also this aspect of digital ageism wherein the platform is so ageist that it creates exclusionary experiences for older people. So I'll show you some photos here. So with automation and recommender system, my participants were so joyful to have, for example, Netflix on or YouTube on their television, wherein they get to access this tailored content that they like. However, the downside is that you can see this Jesus Christ post in here. That's a scam. One of my participants kept on posting religious quotes on Facebook, and that's picked up by Facebook. And now she's being targeted by cryptocurrency aligning with religious narratives. And she's unaware that it's actually that personalization happening and exploiting her. At the same time, there's also a participant in here. She always goes to the doctor, and whenever she goes to the doctor, she would be exiting the clinic and then starting to receive all of these chatbots selling her products with medicines, and she's getting annoyed and confused. So these are just examples of how these platforms are operating, that the older people are fascinated, can be feeling joyful, but at the same time, it's becoming a nuance to their aging experiences, and it adds stress to their body. And then we have the digital inequalities narratives with social exclusion perspective. I really like the work of course, we built on the work by Vanchik on issues of access, skills, and outcomes. But at the same time, the social and structural conditions, as according to HealthSpur, would be talking about these social digital inequalities that should be inquired through a situated and relational perspective, but also centering social inequalities merged with digital inequalities. And I think that's important for us to zoom into what are the kind of like practices beyond the technologies that might be shaping the way people perceive and experience technology. And with the literature on older people, there's so many discussions about the exclusion, but also for older migrants, which is based on ownership of devices, language barriers, declining health, and digital illiteracies. But there's always this kind of like discussion about how do they navigate these issues. They rely on their support networks, which I noticed with my research, they're not always available, and often the presence of the support network can make the older person or older migrant feel like they're a burden and the way they communicate in that space. And obviously, there's a study by Ho, Chua, and Feng talking about the networks not only locally, transnationally, but also digitally, which I presented in Singapore before, talking about this social-technical vortex, care vortex, wherein this kind of like networks of care is not only about people, but also about the platform shaping the experiences. I'll talk about a bit of my method because it's quite interesting as well to really think about how do we do multi-sited and visual ethnography. So I did a bit of like long research field work from November 2023 to November 2024. And then I did a follow-up on May to July 2025. So kind of like more than a year of extensive field work in different places in Victoria, Australia, but also the Philippines. So I interviewed 96 people and conducted 82 house visits across different sites and used interviews, content elicitation, photo documentation, and recorded demonstrations. When I say recorded demonstration, I asked the participants to tell me how they use a certain app. For example, switch on the smart television or use that, because that will allow you to give that affective, situated, and mobile engagement with certain devices and giving you a window of how social relationships are in effect and barriers are entangled in those practices. So I particularly use, by the way, a smartphone just to capture for research only. I didn't use my own personal phone to separate that distinction. So I did coordinate with the older Filipino Australians through SMS, Facebook Messenger, and FaceTime because they want to see my face before I interview them. There's so much trust building. And then from there, they nominated their support networks in Victoria, but also in the Philippines. But as part of my ethics application, they had to contact first the network before I spoke to the networks. So they should agree, then I will contact them and explain the project. So it was okay for doing this trust building in Victoria, Australia, because they know me. I'm in Victoria, Australia. The interesting part was in the Philippines because they thought I'm a scammer. So when I was there, actually, I called the participant. Someone told me, "Oh, whose doctor is this? What are you talking about? You're a coward. You're a scammer." And so I was so shocked because That's a challenge for a researcher, that because I was based in Australia, I'm based in Australia, and that person is in the Philippines. So I had to go back to the participant in Victoria to tell that participant, did you explain well, or you want to speak again to your relative? So that person spoke, and then that clarified that kind of like arrangement. So I use Viber, WhatsApp, and Facebook Messenger to coordinate with the participants in the Philippines, because I was still based in Victoria, Australia. And then when I arrived there, I bought a SIM card, and then I told them this will be my number and kindly save the number. This is the map of Victoria, Australia on your left. I did a fieldwork in Melbourne and some regional areas of Ballarat, Geelong, and Warrnambool. And then in the Philippines, I did a lot of fieldwork in Luzon. And then you see there Visayas and then a bit of Mindanao. I wasn't allowed to fly to Mindanao by my university because of that travel advisory. So I did a remote interview through a video call, which was fascinating because we're relying on the internet. And when you use a video call, it revealed how fast the internet in the Philippines was. So it was very blurry. And when showing me things, it was blurry. So, but that's a form of data because it tells you the situated conditions shaping the connectivity. So as you can see in Victoria, Australia, very smooth, very kind of like sanitized, environment. But in the Philippines, it's quite challenging with the wires and the traffic that I had to deal in terms of moving around to different sites and coordinating them in different locations. I also had incident wherein my phone had a problem with the battery. I was stuck in a train station in a regional area. I tried to contact my participant who picked me up in the train station, and that was interesting as well because it was also building trust, but also providing support in the research. And when I was in the Philippines, I was always coordinating with my participants in Australia to find their place. One participant was even showing me the photos of their house, of their map, because I was lost with the driver. I couldn't find where the location was. So that's part of the method discussion that I'll be working on for my paper. And also this photo wherein you can see like no internet. I was going up to this mountain and we were relying on Facebook Messenger, no connection. So it was an intermittent connection. So there was a structure with the interviewing in each house. So there will be a small chat when I arrive, a sit-down briefing of what we'll be doing again, although explained through the phone, a sit-down interview, content elicitation, recorded house tour, reenactment of technology use, chatting while eating. So they serve food. And that was interesting for me. The commensality provided more data about practices of the people in the home. For example, one of my participants, she even baked a Filipino bread for me. And she said, don't eat it, Irvin, yet. I'll take a photo and then I'll put it on Facebook. So that's interesting for me as a practice of the domestication of technology, but also part of the method. And then I wrote a lot of field notes in terms of that space. So this photo in here, that's a screenshot of me talking to the person in Mindanao, but we did the Viber video call. So there were times it was clear, there were times that it wasn't. So it's a challenge in terms of like the field work. But also another challenge is to make sure I'm actually real, that I am not a scammer. So whenever I arrive in the Philippines, I would inform my participant in Australia about the schedule of the interview and when I will arrive, and they can call through video call. As you can see in here, that's a screenshot of the participant calling me at the time that I was already at home and verifying that I'm actually Dr. Irvin or Irvin who will be interviewing them. Because there was so much discussion about digital scamming, digital trust in this space, and I had to navigate that with this particular issue. And that I think is relating to how we conduct research now transnationally, especially if we enter the home, which is very private and very kind of like intimate. So I did 96 interviews with 35 participants, older people, and then 30 participants, their networks, and then 31 back home. So that's 82 house visits as well. So mostly when I say older migrants in here, the categorization is 65 years old. But in the Philippines, older person is considered 60 years old, so it's a bit lower. When I was in the Philippines, I had 16 participants out of 31 who were 60 years old and above. But mostly here, they're all aging and 65. So in terms of the employment, majority were retired. Some were still working and doing part-time work. Some were studying because they're like nephews or nieces, and some were working back in the Philippines, either nephews or nieces of the participants. Most participants had a bachelor's degree, and some completed high school as the highest educational attainment, and some with the master's degree, which I'll be talking about shortly with this participant who's quite confident in terms of technology use. So as you can see on the chart, 35 participants in Victoria, 65 and over, in Victoria Support Network, 21, and then back in the Philippines, 14. So what this tell me with these participants, so the network back home and in here, they're also aging. They're either the sibling or the friend of the older person. And that's when I start thinking about, if they're aging, who is also supporting them in that space to be able to allow the communication between the support network and my main participants. So there was kind of like mapping of who are actually supporting these individuals. So there are key areas of digital practice that I uncovered with the research: accessing government and social welfare services in Australia, MyGov, Centrelink for the pension, My Aged Care Services, and Medicare for the medical. Economic transactions focusing on online banking, online shopping, sending remittances, and even sending balikbayan boxes or boxes filled with goods. Then we have the personal use, communicating with family members, relatives, and peers, and accessing producing contents related to entertainment, travel, leisure, hobbies, religious practices, and so forth. And there's also political engagement, accessing news and contents in the Philippines and in Australia. Okay, I'll present four stories in here, four case studies, for us to think to see how this network mobility divide is enacted and negotiated by my participants. So I'll introduce Bill. Bill is 70 years old, and the support network in Victoria is Sally, the wife, 72 years old. They're living together. And then I follow the family back home, and that's Mike, 73 years old, the brother. Then we meet Divine. Divine is 80 years old, living with the son, the brother of Arman in here, who is also like 59 years old. But Divine is living with the brother of Arman, but they're not really in good terms. So Arman would often drop by in the house and just assist her. And then back home, I follow the niece nominated by Divine in the Philippines. And this is an interesting story. Later, we'll talk about how they're having all of these conversations on Facebook Messenger about taking care of the land, but also 7 cats that I saw in the house, like 7 cats. So then you have Faith. Faith is 82 years old, with the brother co-living in a granny flat in the one compound, 68 years old. And I follow the brother back home, and that's 75 years old, Carl. And the last participant is Carlos, 74 years old, co-living with the wife, 79 years old, Jasmine. And then I follow the family member back in the Philippines, the sister Ella, and staying in the province. So as you can see in here, they're all like a bit like 70, 80, 82, 74. But despite the ages, I will show you the kind of interest with technology doesn't necessarily relate to age. It depends on their interest, their backgrounds, and their exposure to technologies. But also highlighting that their networks back home, they're quite aging as well, because the Philippines has an increasingly aging population. So with more than 109 million 65 year and over. So really an aging population back home. And there we go. This is the story. I'll stay with this chart first because it's kind of like mapping the personal background of the participants. So Bill is with a bachelor's and master's degree, and he's the one who's very confident when I interviewed him about technology use. So he moved to Australia in 1982 after marrying the wife in 1981. They moved because of economic hardships, but they're quite middle class, as he admitted back home. Because of the authoritarian government problem in the Philippines, they left the Philippines. When he moved to Australia, he worked in government, and he retired at age 55. That's quite young. Now he has 2 children with 4 grandchildren, co-living with the wife, owns a house bought in 1985, and no obligation to send remittances and support family members and relatives back home. This is an economic kind of like perspective, male, I'm stable and I'm using technology. Now let's move to Divine. Divine finished high school and started working to support herself and family in the province of the Philippines. She moved to Australia as part of this wave of Filipino women, as part of marrying men and to become wives and have children. So the husband died in 2007. They don't have a child. So he has 2 children from the ex-partner who was a faith healer in the Philippines. And I suspect he was molested, but she wasn't really saying that. But they had a kid, like 2 kids. So now she has 4 grandchildren. She worked for more than 18 years as a cleaner in aged care and in a university. She has limited pension because of the deduction, also buying her medicines, but also on a rent assistance through the government support, co-living with the son, and supporting her family back home financially. So this is where it's becoming interesting when you have all of these kind of like conditions. Now let's move to Faith. Faith finished the bachelor's degree, business administration, taught in the Philippines, moved to Australia in 1970s with the husband, who's an engineer. But the husband died, I think, in 2016 due to lung cancer. So there are eight in the family, two left, one left in the Philippines, and that's the brother I met when I visited the Philippines. But the rest are all in Australia, stable, retiring with pension and everything. She owns her house, co-living with the brother, supports a sibling back home, only one, that person I interviewed. And then we have Carlos, who finished high school, a love child of the mother, but not sent to school. So he just finished high school, he was saying. Migrated to Australia in 1988, followed the wife to a job. They have three children and three grandchildren, has three siblings who are still alive. And he's sending money back home, but he doesn't have a pension because the wife is still working. So Australia evaluates your pension as a couple depending if someone is still working, depending on your properties or assets and stuff like that. So this is a full picture of they're all aging, but they all have differing kind of like backgrounds and capacities and also interests in terms of technology. And that will be reflected with the mapping of technology landscapes, right? Technology use. So Bill, because he was working in the government, he started using a computer in 1980s. He was using a brick phone, which is a very big phone. He showed me that. And now he's using a smartphone, a laptop, and a desktop computer. He uses WhatsApp, Viber, Gmail, and YouTube, but he doesn't use Facebook because he believes of the privacy concerns of using Facebook, collecting his data. He even said, I don't want Facebook because it's an electronic gossiping. When you post something, people gossip about you on Facebook. So he's like very clear in that. And that literacy also allowed him to actually access my age care and MyGov through online platforms. But because of his feeling of anxiety with technology, he doesn't do online banking. He pays via credit card. And he did online shopping once, but he stopped because he was victimized by a shopping issue, like a product that he bought that was problematic. And then he always talked about security online when we were having the interviews. And he has a Netflix, he pays his Netflix, and he has a Google Home, but he doesn't use it because he doesn't know yet. But then you have Divine, not use a computer in her entire life, and now using a smartphone provided by the son. She has a tablet computer, and the only use of tablet computer is to access YouTube and then watch all of these contents. She's using Facebook, Facebook Messenger, YouTube, and Viber. No Netflix, no online banking and online shopping, and no support yet with my age care. So she's really disadvantaged financially, but also in terms of the digital landscape. Next, we also have this Faith. So she used a computer at work, so she's interested in learning technologies. Both a smartphone with a siblings assistant, has two iPads and a smartphone, play online games. She uses voice assistants like Alexa and Google Home. She accesses all of the services from the government, does use Facebook, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, but also she doesn't use online banking and online shopping because she's afraid. However, the lack of access to those resource platforms would be supported by her children. The children would be buying items for her online. And then you have Carlos, did not use a computer at all at work, no my age care yet, but use MyGov learning from someone's assistance, using email, a laptop, no online banking and online shopping because of the fear, use a remittance app with the help of the wife, but also using Facebook, Facebook Messenger, Viber, YouTube, WhatsApp, Google, but attempts to use Google Home, but it was failing. So Carlos was interesting because he told me that he's not really confident in terms of technology use. Now, we look at a while ago the social conditions and now the digital landscape and how's that panning out in terms of the networks, right? So for Bill, the network in Australia is for the companionship, the wife, and then manages the household purse string. So she runs the online banking. She's an accountant. So Bill would be trusting the wife to do that. Okay. For Divine, Arman sets up the television, like cable free to air television, assist with tech issues like password ringtone dropping by from time to time. However, that's quite limited because Arman was not in good terms with the brother and they don't want to see each other in the home. So very limited visit. Next, we have Faith in here with Bobby living in her in the compound. Look, they're living in that space, and kind of like Faith was also given a Google Home and setting it up by the brother, and manages the remittance for the brother back in the Philippines. But also the brother in Victoria, Australia, Bobby, would be managing the password of Faith, having that kind of like support. For Carlos, it's the wife using and assisting him in terms of tech assistance, taught him to use email, Facebook, and Facebook Messenger. Now, you might be wondering what's the role of those in the Philippines. So the one in the Philippines, for Mike, it's not necessarily addressing a tech issue, but really providing more of like connection back home and providing this support when they're visiting back in the Philippines. So they're connecting through Facebook Messenger, but also providing an accommodation for Bill when he's visiting the Philippines, but sometimes sharing effective contents through information on automation, on other kind of like stuff on Facebook Messenger. The interesting part is actually Divine with the niece Joe. So they connect through Facebook Messenger and Viber and managing the issue of the missing land title of the Divine's house in the Philippines, but also taking care of Divine's 7 cats and a dog. So I'll show you later some of the photos about this kind of like narrative and managing the remittances for the cat. But because the two children of Divine, they don't trust Joe in managing the title of the land and also the money. They think that Joe is exploiting the finances of their mother, Divine. So they're not really in good terms. And at the same time, we get to look at the story of Faith and Faith with the brother Carl connecting via Facebook Messenger. But Carl is more of like receiving the remittances, but in return, he's taking care of the family's ancestral house in Manila where we did the interview. And then you have Carlos, you have the sister back home connecting via Facebook Messenger. And when a companion, when the wife works, so they usually do video call. So you can see in here the kind of like different practices connecting locally and transnationally, but also the kind of mobilities happening in digital spaces are shaped by their networks, but also the kind of like platforms that they're using, which I've discussed now. So Bill is very confident in using technology. So he showed me this setup of the of the computer where he does all of his work. You know, he's very religious, so he created this leaflet on religion, and he even gave me a copy and showing me that he designed the layout and stuff like that. So he's very aware of security and privacy. So the photo in the middle, he showed me that he'll always have to look at the padlock of like a link or a website before he checks it. So he doesn't really need technical assistance from family members and aware how the platform feeds information, as you can see in here. That's his email. He's complaining that he's been receiving ads of dating apps and then women being from Europe or somewhere, kind of like appearing on his email. And he's telling me that this is happening because he's a man and the algorithm is actually pushing information to a man that they think that lonely man would be needing a partner from somewhere. So that's his understanding. So he has an understanding of how algorithms recommendation system would be working. And he even was searching a number of a scammer on Google. And it took us like 30 minutes to search for something during the fieldwork because he was really showing me things. So he's very confident. So he doesn't need like assistance. But for Divine, it's interesting because the economic condition is creeping into the understanding of technology. So she's very less literate, but also struggling financially. This photo is actually her showing me coins from selling the fruits from her tree because she really sells those fruits because she's really struggling financially. And she's really kind of like thinking about the medicines that she needs to buy. And she's thinking and pressured to sell her house in the Philippines, which Joe, the niece, is the one she's asked to handle, right? So she's less literate in terms of technology, using basic stuff, and she doesn't even know how like why things are working, why it's like that. And as you can see in here, the photo lower right, that's her tablet computer. Because no one's assisting her. It's broken. She told me, Irvin, can you check my tablet computer? It doesn't work. I look at it. The reason why it's not working, the Wi-Fi was switched off. When I switched it on, she was so happy. She was like, "Oh my God, you're so great!" Because now I can watch my favorite show on YouTube because the tablet is also used for YouTube and having that moment. So I think that's an interesting part because the son wouldn't drop by from time to time because of the tension in the family. And now in here, because she's so pressured to sell the house in the Philippines, the photo in the middle is actually so she assigned the niece back home, daughter of I think of her brother, to take care of selling of the land. So in exchange of that, I'll provide money that you can use some of the money for your rent. But she has to take care of 7 cats and a dog. So she has to buy grocery with this amount of money, and then she has to take photos that the money will be going for those expenses in that space. But at the same time, because in the terms of technology use, Divine is not really literate with the platform operation algorithm. She's just complaining about so many chatbots, like new ones. Like she's just there's so many people chatting with me. Like as you can see here, I blurred all of that, but those are like medical companies, different companies chatting to her, selling products about her condition, medical stuff. So she finds it a new ones, but she couldn't explain why it's like that. And she thinks that someone is chatting to her and she doesn't know how to block those individuals. Then you have Faith, 82 years old, but very exploratory and very active. So she's into showcasing her creative expression. And this is for me a form of showing, kind of like subverting this digital ageism that older people are not active, they're a burden, they're slow. But for her, she's showcasing that she can do flower arrangement on Facebook. She does play with avatars, changing her face, her glasses, and stuff like that. She's showcasing what she's baking. This is the character, the person who baked the food and asked me not to eat it first. That's the one. And she's like taking photo. At the same time, she has all of this support from the brother Bobby with this Google Home. And then I asked, and also the Apple Watch and stuff. And then I asked her to ask Google to play her favorite music, and her favorite music is Michael Bublé. And then she asked Google to play the music. But you know what's interesting? After the music played, there was an ad because she's not paying premium, and she was annoyed because of that kind of like nuance. So this is a kind of like practice in that space, but also she's afraid of scams, so the children would be doing the buying for her. And then you have Carlos in here who admitted that he's not confident using technology, less uploading on Facebook, but also learning from the wife and community support, but always being frustrated in terms of multiple calls from scammers, but also this Google Home in here that I even assisted him how to switch it on, because he always like, oh, play music, and I ask her, I can help with the if you want, and then he said, yeah, teach me, and then I said, you started, hey Google. When he said, hey Google, so it light up. He was so happy because he's able to communicate to Google Home, but the wife was telling him, because he's not that confident, so he's not really engaging with technology. And this is kind of interesting part when we start looking at technologies of older people and their practices. So what I noticed in here, in terms of my research, it's important to map the earlier use of digital technologies and how they shape the current practices of these individuals despite the age. So the background would be playing a role in that space, as you saw in the case of Faith, working before in office, but also, for example, with Bill, that training and also the educational background. But at the same time, the prior tech experiences and perceived benefits would be shaping the use of these technologies. What I noticed, older migrants attempted to use online banking and online shopping, but mostly would be withdrawing from online shopping because they were scammed and they didn't know how to actually address it. Sometimes they don't have support. So that's a form of like disconnection in that space. And also situated conditions with their personal backgrounds and social relations. It's a question, for example, a while ago with Divine. So she's struggling with technology, no available support. I was there, I became the support. But then when you try to unpack that, it's because of the tension in the family that's creating the limited mobility and support in that space. But also connecting locally and transnationally in terms of like, for example, how online platforms might also becoming a mediator in that space. So let's look at the social networks first. So locally, you have them assisting, but then you also have the transnational connections providing that support for these people whenever they visit, or kind of like just be a companion, like in the case of, for example, Carlos and the sister. But at the same time, what I noticed with the aging is being shaped by the platforms with personalization, automation, recommender systems, but at the same time, limited literacies, not only with older people, but sometimes with their social network as well, who are aging, and those who are younger but not really adept in terms of understanding how platforms might be working. So there's a presence of support networks in there, but also the researcher can become a support network if possible because of the lack of support. But what I also noticed would be technologies and online channels becoming ageist. So people were complaining, some of my participants, fonts were too small. Sometimes ads will just appear and then they download it, and then suddenly they're being charged with downloading the app. And sometimes the content will be tailored to them, talking about a medicine in the Philippines, but then they realize, oh, it's actually fake when I bought it. So those things are actually creeping into the lives of older people, and they tend to question, is this authentic or not? And then they ask their network if this is real or not, or is it safe or not. But it's not always available for the networks to be there to be informing them if that's safe. And that's kind of like paving the way for them to be victimized, which I notice people living alone are more likely to be victimized by scammers and would really be helpless to respond to scams as opposed to those co-living with family members because they have someone to chat with and have a conversation on this particular content. And I think overall, I was actually just kind of like reflecting on this idea of really thinking about the network mobility divide. That the divide is about access, resources, but outcomes. But I'm more looking at the outcomes of how mobilities are constructed in digital spaces, and this web of networks, but also web of capacities, webs of resources, but also how the platforms operating, shaping the experiences of the migrants, older migrants, as they age, for example, in Australia, but also connecting to the Philippines. So for me, the home, as I was mentioning earlier before the presentation to Chidem and Denise, the home is very open to platforms because we use the technology in the home, we capture activities and stuff like that, and that's contributing to the datification. But at the same time, when I was visiting the participant's house, you have all of this Google Home, you have all of this smart television. They're all technologies, asking for data, but they're all part of the domestication, and that's allowing companies to tailor content for you but also to victimize you in certain practices and in certain conditions. So there are differential mobilities in that space. And I think digital inclusion is, of course, that social digital inequalities perspective by Healthspur would be helpful to think about social and digital inequalities. But at the same time, we need to think about how this role of the platform and not having the literacy to understand how platforms operate would be shaping aging experiences and our understanding of digital divide and also inclusion for those who are trying to use technology, but then sometimes will be victimized because they do not have that literacy to navigate such complex and very automated environment. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. And I really like that you highlight some of the case studies. It really feels like you get to know the participants that you've been getting to know. And I also want to applaud you for the field work that you have been doing. It's very extensive and shows a lot of interesting results. I want to open the floor first for questions. We have about 10 minutes left because otherwise I have a bunch, but oh yeah, yes.
Thank you, Erwin, for this wonderful presentation. I have so many questions. It was super interesting, but maybe I want to say also that you have done 96 interviews, and I would call it multi-sided ethnography. You've been also being very modest in the.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I limit myself given the time. Well, I have two questions. Let me see how far we can go. The first one, because it was very interesting from the digital perspective. Well, as maybe Chidam would have more questions about, but of course, coming from a network and social support network perspective, I have more questions on that front. I was wondering because you mentioned you have conducted interviews with 35 older migrants in Australia.
Yes.
Those were, in network terms, your egos.
Yes, that's right.
And then you have done some in Philippines. I don't recall the exact
31.
31 in the Philippines, and then the rest were
30.
Australia all around. So I really wonder what did add, because talking to alters, that is in network methods, we tend to only talk to the egos, to the persons, and we ask about the network from the ego's perspective. There are so many few studies, including myself, that talked a little bit also with the alters, but selected ones. So I really want to listen from you. How was it And what did you learn that you wouldn't do otherwise from the egos, let's say, only talking to the egos, in terms of the support and the networks, but also in terms of the use of the digital technologies? Okay, I stop maybe first.
Okay, I'll quickly answer that so we have more questions. So thank you very much for that question. So it's interesting to interview 30 people more in Victoria. So that's a network, and then 31 in the Philippines. For me, what's actually very clear is that sometimes the participants would be telling me, like the older person in Australia, that oh, I connect with this person, providing me support, connecting me back home. But then when you start talking to the network, they talk about the issues of connecting. For example, in the Philippines, they're actually pressured to always take photos of the remittance output. Like if I buy a product, I need to take a photo and send it to the group chat. Or for example, the husband of the older participant in Australia would be checking, because one of my participants was building a church in the province where I went to. So the husband was so grumpy, and then this participant in the Philippines told me, they kept on rushing us about things, but we don't even have electricity here in the province. And they even told me, Irvin, you are here. You are a witness. Tell them. So the researcher can actually be a witness. And I didn't tell the participant in Victoria because part of the ethical kind of like consideration that space. But it's revealing that tension with the kinship, with connecting here and there, but also in Victoria, Australia, even like their local networks, they're talking about, oh, because she's my mom, she's always asking me about this, and I feel like I need to do it. I need to help her or him because they're my parents, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the parents would, but the eagles would they just be talking, oh, they're actually great, they're helping me, supporting me and stuff. But the tension is actually in that space.
Yeah, so I would be also happy to read another paper, maybe
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that after you're finishing. And what I also liked very much in your presentation is that you not only showed the ageism and the digital divide, they are vulnerable and the scams are there, but you did not put them always in the vulnerable position, but also showed
No.
how they're also using the digital resources positively, what I really liked very much. And my second question, then I really stopped because I want others. Were there any? I know that in the 4 cases you talked about 2 men and 2 women,
Yes.
but you have, of course, many interviews, many cases. I wonder if you've ever seen any gendered patterns in terms of digital use or in terms of support. So, thanks.
I'm working on that paper actually because the gender dimension with my participants was very clear in terms because we associate, for example, technologies with men. That's why some of my participants, like I was assuming they'll be like some of them that were driving the conversation, how great they know the technology, but they also have Carlos who's not really confident in terms of technology. So what I saw in my field work is that women who are really into technology, it becomes an additional unpaid labor for them. For example, if the husband doesn't want to use the government apps, they will be handling it for their husband. Then they also need to use the technology for their husband who doesn't probably buy items online. So it's an addition, but also, for example, additional labor with the household. Like, for example, they take care of their husband, their children, grandchildren, but they also need to sometimes maintain the technology when it's failing, it's not working. So, for example, one participant, she was like, "Oh my God, my husband is not really into fixing the internet. I had to call someone, I had to fix YouTube, and anyways, I know how to do it because she's confident in technology, so I do it." So it's an additional labor in the household with the technology for aging older women.
Jada, I
I
think was
could also,
first.
okay, very short question, Erwin. This is really
Yeah,
cool
yes, it is.
project. I can only second what Başak has said in terms of like both the rigor of the method, but also the approach that you are taking in a nuanced way, not just vulnerabilizing the participants. Short question about like the public and institutional support around the older migrants. I know you didn't, yeah, you looked at it more from the participants' perspectives, but what we see here
Right.
in the Netherlands is when the public support is designed, mostly aging migrants are not necessarily, or also generally migrants are not necessarily at the center of these public policies,
Right.
support structures. Do you also see that in Australia or in the Philippines, if that's the case?
I can say that in Australia, there's an attempt to actually create programs for older migrants. So we have the Be Connected program. We have like trainings in the library. We have trainings, for example, we call it the caravan. So caravans bank, they now do move from one suburb to another suburb to campaign about scamming and stuff like that. But when I attended, for example, a session on scamming, the terms were so technical that the people was telling me, I don't understand what is multi-factor authentication. So that kind of like tailoring has to be addressed. But also, for example, some of my participants talk about, because I asked them, what do you think the government should be doing in terms of supporting like older migrants with technology use? They were saying, oh, they're actually providing some stuff, but they need to tailor it more and be more consistent in terms of, for example, we attend seminars on scamming, but it's basically just defining terms. But we don't hear stories like what I uncovered in my fieldwork, that these are real stories of scamming and how it's happening in real time. I even actually helped someone being scammed. $33,000. If I didn't arrive, he'll transfer the money. So that kind of like moment and stuff. So the government is trying, but it's not trying to tailor it, but it has to have more of the grassroots mobilization. Philippines, the government is trying to create programs for, we call it Happy Senior, programs for senior Filipinos. But again, that economic condition is shaping that. Like the 16 people I interviewed back home, for example, they're not even going out because of economic precarities. They don't have the finances to travel and stuff like that. So they rely on their family members who are around them or something like that. So it's very family oriented. But then because you need to think about the family orientedness is also created by the lack of kind of like alignment or tailoring from the government. And stuff like that.
Thank you.
And then last question, if you're so okay with that, Irvin, as well.
Yeah, go.
Claire?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. Got a question about using digital apps or whatever for travel, particularly how people get around and how they're supported, for instance, through their relatives. Do they have to have e-tickets or use smartphones to organize travel, for instance, Google Maps or whatever? So I'm just interested in, because you're talking a lot about remittances and using Facebook to upload pictures of their baking projects or something, but I'm wondering how it manifests itself when moving around and getting support for that. And also, is there a difference in how people present themselves in an interview about their digital engagements and how you observe them in everyday kind of practices when doing kind of visual ethnography?
That's actually a very good question, the last part. So let's talk about the digital apps first. So what I noticed with my participants, they try to not use much of the apps because they find that when they become so addictive, they're less mobile and not good for older people. So what they do, for example, with remittances, instead of using the app, they go to the bank and they go to a remittance center. So they become mobile. That's the reason why they also don't like online shopping, because they're just sitting down and they couldn't touch the item and they're less mobile. So they want the exercise as part of mobility. However, in booking tickets, some of my participants would be asking their children to book things for them, but also make sure that the children will be updating them just in case there's a change with the travel schedule or the flight and stuff like that. So there's always that network assisting them. At the same time, in some cases, they have friends who are aging, who are into technology, who will be doing the mass booking and even doing the mass shopping and doing all of these digital transactions. So kind of like very support network. So the last question about presenting themselves, but also online. So this is, I actually thought of this participant wherein she was talking about hardship, but when she projects on Facebook, it's a fabulous lifestyle. So what I'm saying in here is like when I went to her house, she was very busy. She's renting in a government run house. And she was telling me, oh, Irvin, I actually, I dress up like this in the house. I don't dress up much and stuff. But, on Facebook, I always dress up because I want my family members to see that I'm actually active, also happy, and stuff like that. So when we did the tour in her house, she showed me in one bedroom all of the dresses that she's wearing on Facebook, but also it has a kinship element because some of the dresses were given by the daughter who'd be parachuting from time to time to visit her. She avoids posting photos that will make her like less, as she said, because she wants to project this big person. But there's also people who would be performing this very vital self. That's a part of subverting this ageism that, associate older people as sitting down or just not moving around, something like that. So my participants was showcasing their garden, their stuff like this. But I found out that some of them, they don't do the gardening, it's the partner, but they show it as them. So they kind of like perform a different persona. But at the same time, they also avoid posting food photos, travel, because that's becoming an entry point for family members who are in struggling economically to message them and borrow money. And they tell them that I'm on pension, I don't have enough money, so don't borrow money from me. And this moment that I'm enjoying is just me enjoying that moment. So kind of like negotiation of visibility for older people as well. Yeah.
Well, with that, I would like to thank all of you for being here for this webinar, but especially Irvin for talking about this interesting research. I think we
Thank
could
you
have
very
extended
much.
it to a 2-hour webinar and we would still have so much to talk about. But I'm very happy to have had you as a guest here. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation at a later moment.
No
Thank you
worries.
so
I'm
much.
happy to do a workshop down the track if you like thinking about visuals, performativity, and what is inequality actually performed and negotiated in digital spaces through the data points that like Claire was talking about this representation. That was interesting. Like what do they perform online but also offline? Yeah.
I think that would be very interesting. And we
Yeah.
would be very open to having conversations about that. Absolutely.
No
Yes.
worries. I'm an email away. Denise.
Thank you